He stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, smiling warmly as the CEO shook his hand and congratulated him on his brilliant $2 million strategy. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply took a slow sip of my black coffee and gently tapped the screen of my phone, forwarding a meticulously compiled email thread directly to the projector's main inbox. 48 hours later, his 20-year career collapsed into absolute ruin, and he never saw it coming. My name is Elena. For 3 years, I worked as a senior analyst under Marcus Sterling at one of New York's top-tier tech consulting firms. Marcus was the kind of man who wore bespoke Italian suits and carried an air of unearned confidence that most people mistook for competence. He was a master of the corporate illusion. He never actually created anything of value, but he was exceptionally gifted at attaching his name to the sweat and brilliance of those beneath him. To the executive board, he was a visionary. To the junior staff, he was a parasite. And I was his favorite host. In the beginning, the theft was subtle. It always is, isn't it? It starts with the weaponization of the word we. I would spend 70 hours a week building a comprehensive market analysis model, burning the midnight oil until my eyes ached, skipping dinners, and sacrificing weekends. I would send it to him for review. The next morning, in the daily stand-up meeting, Marcus would look at the team and say, "I was looking over the data last night, and I realized we need to pivot." He would present my exact findings, my exact phrasing, as a spontaneous epiphany he had over his morning espresso. When I tried to speak up, he would offer a paternal, patronizing smile and say, "Great support on this, Elena. We make a great team." It's a very specific kind of psychological warfare. They don't silence you by telling you to shut up. They silence you by making you complicit in your own erasure. New York can be an incredibly lonely city when you were the only one awake in a glass tower at 2 in the morning. I remember staring out at the Manhattan skyline, watching the headlights of taxicabs crawling along the wet pavement far below. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the empty office was my constant companion. I was drinking lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, my eyes burning from the glare of dual monitors, while Marcus was presumably asleep in his sprawling Upper East Side penthouse. This was our silent arrangement. I provided the labor, the intellect, the sacrifice. He provided the signature. It is a soul-crushing experience to watch your own brilliant ideas be regurgitated by a mediocre man who barely understands the concepts he is presenting. I watched him fumble through my financial projections during client calls, using buzzwords to cover up his deep ignorance of the actual mechanics. And every time he stumbled, he would look to me, expecting me to seamlessly feed him the answer without making it look like I was correcting him. I was not just his ghostwriter, I was his safety net. Over time, the subtle thefts escalated. Marcus learned exactly how much he could take without triggering a formal HR complaint. He knew I needed this job. I was paying off significant student loans, and the firm's prestige was the golden ticket I needed for my long-term career. He exploited the hunger. He fed on my ambition, turning me into a ghostwriter for his corporate ascent. Every slide deck, every financial projection, every innovative pitch that came out of his office was entirely my creation. I became the silent engine of his success, locked in a windowless cubicle while he shook hands on the golf course and collected 6-figure bonuses. Then came Project Olympus. Project Olympus was the crown jewel of the fiscal year, a massive infrastructure overhaul for our largest international client. The contract was worth $2 million in immediate revenue and practically guaranteed a promotion to partner for whoever landed it. The CEO made it clear the firm needed a flawless, revolutionary strategy to beat out our competitors. Marcus, predictably, dumped the entire assignment on my desk with a casual email. "Need you to mock up some preliminary thoughts on Olympus. Just a rough draft. We'll refine it together." I didn't give him a rough draft. I gave him a masterpiece. For 6 weeks, I lived and breathed Project Olympus. I bypassed our internal databases and reached out to industry contacts. I ran predictive algorithms that the firm didn't even know we had access to. I built a 70-page strategy document that was bulletproof. It was the best work of my life. And I knew deep down that this was my leverage. This was the project that would finally force him to bring me into the spotlight. I had explicitly outlined in our internal communications that my presentation of this data to the client was crucial for its execution. But Marcus had other plans. The gaslighting reached its absolute peak 2 days before the final presentation. He started excluding me from the prep meetings, claiming it was executive eyes only until the final polish. He would stand by my desk, hovering, demanding access to the raw files, the editable slide decks, the back-end data models. When I asked him what time I should be ready to present, he didn't even look me in the eye. "Oh, the CEO prefers a streamlined pitch," he said, adjusting his expensive tie. "I'll be taking the lead on the delivery. You just make sure the printouts are collated and on the table by 8 a.m. You're a rock star, Elena." He was stripping me of my own work right in front of my face and expecting me to smile while he did it. He expected me to be the good, obedient soldier. If you are listening to this, and something about this dynamic feels uncomfortably familiar, I need you to understand exactly what is happening to you. In toxic systems, whether in a family or a corporate hierarchy, keeping the peace is nothing more than slow self-destruction with a polite name. You are taught that sacrificing your boundaries, your credit, and your voice is the noble thing to do. It isn't noble. You are simply funding someone else's ego with your own sanity. They use your empathy and your professionalism as a weapon against you. They know you won't make a scene, and they weaponize your decency to ensure their dominance. You cannot reason with a system that directly benefits from misunderstanding you. The only way to win is to stop playing by their rules and start writing your own. I sat at my desk that evening, staring at the final, locked version of the Project Olympus file. I could feel the familiar weight of submission trying to pull me under. I could hear the voice in my head telling me to just let it go, to wait for the next opportunity, to be a team player. But then, I opened my email outbox. I looked at the digital trail, and what I'm about to tell you is the part I almost left out. But you need to hear it. What I've told you so far is how he operated in the light. What comes next is how I dismantled him in the dark. I didn't argue with Marcus when he told me to just prep the printouts. I nodded, my face a perfect, placid mask of corporate compliance. "Of course, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'll have everything collated by 8 a.m. He clapped my shoulder, a heavy, patronizing weight, and walked out. The second the glass door clicked shut, my blood ran cold. The submission was gone. The desperation evaporated. I sat down, pulled my keyboard close, and began the architecture of his ruin. If you are going to take down a senior executive, you do not do it with tears, and you certainly do not do it by going to human resources. HR exists to protect the company from liability, not to protect you from your boss. You do it with metadata. Let me be very clear about this. A paper trail is not just a collection of angry emails or vague complaints. A true paper trail is a mathematically verifiable sequence of dates, timestamps, and read receipts that removes human memory from the equation entirely. Financial and intellectual abuse is still abuse, and it leaves an undeniable evidence trail if you know exactly where to bury the digital tripwires. You don't need a lawyer to start building your defense. You just need to understand how server logs work. I opened the master file for Project Olympus. Marcus thought he had locked me out of the final presentation deck by moving it to his personal cloud directory, but he was profoundly lazy. He had left his autosync active on the shared local drive. I didn't delete his copy. I didn't lock him out. I did something much worse. I embedded a customized tracking pixel, a tiny, invisible image file, no larger than a single period, into the master template. Every time the file was opened, edited, or forwarded, it quietly pinged an external, encrypted email address I had set up months ago. I also embedded something else. Deep in the appendices, buried in the raw data tables for the 5-year fiscal projections, I utilized a technique known as steganography. I adjusted the hex codes of the financial charts. To the naked eye, the bars were standard corporate blue. To a hex reader, the color codes spelled out my employee ID number, the date of original creation, and a cryptographic digital signature. It was an invisible watermark woven into the very DNA of the $2 million strategy. Doing this on a company network was a massive risk. At 1:45 right as I was compiling the final metadata lock, the firm's legacy servers initiated their automated maintenance cycle. My screen completely froze. The loading bar hung at 99%. I sat in the silent, empty office, watching the spinning blue wheel of death for 4 agonizing minutes. My stomach tied itself into a knot. If the system crashed now, the corrupted file would trigger an IT alert, and Marcus would be notified immediately. I didn't breathe until the progress bar vanished and the confirmation window finally popped up. 2 days passed. Then the digital snare pulled tight. The tracking pixel started pinging my phone. It started on a Tuesday evening. Ping. Marcus opened the file. Ping. Marcus forwarded the file to his private email. Ping. Marcus sent the file to the CEO, attaching a note claiming it as his final, exclusive draft. I watched the notifications cascade down my screen while I sat in the break room, sipping a glass of iced water. I watched him claim credit for my weeks of sleepless nights with a casual stroke of his keyboard. I didn't know it then, but the email he sent to the CEO contained a fatal, irreversible error, one that would turn a simple plagiarism dispute into a federal compliance violation. Marcus was getting sloppy, drunk on the anticipation of his impending promotion. The Olympus contract required strict adherence to SEC confidentiality protocols because we were handling highly sensitive, pre-merger financial data. By forwarding the raw, unencrypted data model to his personal, unsecured Gmail account, so he could work from home, he had breached our airtight non-disclosure agreement. And because of my tracking pixel, I had the exact timestamp, the IP address, and the precise routing sequence of his breach. He wasn't just stealing my work anymore. He was actively jeopardizing the firm's operating license. The morning of the presentation arrived. The atmosphere on the 42nd floor was electric. Caterers were rolling in carts of artisanal pastries. The client's representatives, 3 stern-faced executives from London, were scheduled to arrive at 9 sharp. Marcus strutted into the bullpen wearing a brand-new Tom Ford suit. He tossed a sleek silver thumb drive onto my desk. "Print 5 copies, full color, heavy cardstock," he commanded, not breaking his stride. "And Elena? Be a doll and grab the London guys some of those imported sparkling waters when they get in." I let out a short, humorless laugh. I picked up the drive, plugged it into my terminal, and verified the file. It was all there. My strategy. My invisible watermarks. I printed the copies exactly as he asked. I bound them in the firm's heavy leather folders. I placed them meticulously at every seat around the massive mahogany conference table. Then, I walked back to my desk, opened my encrypted email account, and compiled a single, comprehensive PDF document. It contained the server logs, the hex code translation key, the tracking pixel read receipts, and the undeniable proof of his SEC compliance breach. I attached it to a new email. I left the to field blank. For now. I gathered my notebook and walked into the boardroom just as the CEO arrived. Marcus saw me step through the heavy glass doors and immediately frowned. "Elena, I told you I'm taking the lead." "You don't need to be in here," he hissed, keeping his voice low. He thought he was dismissing a subordinate. He had no idea he was giving a direct order to his executioner. And what happened in the next 10 minutes would guarantee he never worked in this industry again. For 3 years, I absorbed everything quietly. That ends here. The boardroom smelled of expensive leather and stale anxiety. The 3 executives from London took their seats, arranging their Montblanc pens perfectly parallel to their legal notepads. Our CEO, David, sat at the head of the table, flanked by the senior partners. And then there was Marcus. He stood at the front of the room, adjusting his cuffs, projecting the aura of a man who was about to conquer the world. I stood silently near the back wall by the coffee station, my hands clasped in front of me, a ghost in my own story, exactly where he had ordered me to be. "Gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice dripping with practiced charisma, "I am absolutely thrilled to share the architecture of what I have built for you over the past month. Project Olympus isn't just a financial strategy. It's a complete paradigm shift for global operations." He confidently clicked the projector remote. It didn't register. He frowned, tapped it aggressively against his palm, and clicked again. The title slide finally appeared on the massive 80-inch screen at the front of the room. It was a minor technical hiccup, but I watched a single bead of sweat form at his hairline. He launched into the pitch, confidently reciting the executive summary I had written for him at 3 in the morning just 2 days prior. He was exactly 15 minutes into the presentation when the trap snapped. One of the London executives, a sharp-eyed, meticulous man named Sterling, raised his hand, halting Marcus mid-sentence. "Brilliant overview, Marcus," Sterling said, leaning forward. "But I have a highly specific question regarding the predictive algorithm used for the Q4 capital allocation. How exactly did you weight the currency fluctuation variables in the back-end model?" Marcus offered his trademark, patronizing smile. He casually unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaning against the polished wood of the podium. "That is an excellent question, Richard. When I developed this model, I deliberately focused on high-level strategic synergies. The granular data is quite complex, but we can certainly circle back to the micromechanics later in the session." I took a slow, deliberate breath. "Actually, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice steady, "the algorithm dynamically weights the currency variables based on a rolling 90-day average, which I specifically integrated to address Richard's exact concern." Marcus snapped his head toward me, his eyes flashing with sudden, venomous warning. He had expected me to feed him the answer silently or not speak at all. The audacity of his glare was palpable. "Thank you, Elena," Marcus interrupted sharply, his voice tight and dripping with condescension. "As my assistant pointed out, we have the data." "Moving on, I am not your assistant," I said, stepping away from the wall. I pulled my phone from my pocket. "And we don't need to move on. We can look at the raw data right now." With one tap, I forwarded my compiled PDF, the server logs, the steganography hex codes, and the undeniable proof of his SEC compliance breach directly to the CEO's tablet, which was actively mirrored to the main projector screen. A small, sharp notification chimed. David, our CEO, instinctively tapped the alert on his screen. Instantly, Marcus's pristine slide deck vanished, replaced by a glaring, high-contrast document titled, "Compliance Breach, Unauthorized Transfer of Confidential Client Data." The room went dead silent. Marcus stared at the 80-inch screen, his mouth slightly open. He blinked once, twice, as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. He looked at the IP addresses. He looked at the timestamp proving he had illegally transferred pre-merger financial data to his unsecured personal account. His face drained of all color, shifting from a flushed pink to an ashen, sickly gray. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He simply stared at the undeniable mathematical proof of his own criminality, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The three London executives slowly turned their heads from the screen to Marcus, their expressions hardening into absolute disgust. David stood up. His heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "Marcus," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "What the hell is this?" "That," I said quietly into the heavy silence, "is the truth. If you are listening to this, and you have ever been terrified to stand up to an abuser because you fear the fallout, understand this. Boundaries are simply a description of what you will and what you will not accept. Enforcing those boundaries is not cruelty, it is clarity. Narcissistic systems rely on your guilt to maintain their power over you. They convince you that exposing their abuse makes you the bad guy, the troublemaker, the problem. But leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. You cannot reason with someone who directly benefits from misunderstanding you, but you can absolutely document their destruction." Marcus finally found his voice. It was high-pitched, desperate, and devoid of any corporate polish. "David, this is a complete fabrication. She's a disgruntled junior employee. She's trying to sabotage my promotion because I pushed her too hard." David didn't even look at him. He was scrolling rapidly through the PDF on his tablet, his eyes darting across the hex code translation key. He looked at the financial charts, matching the hidden digital signatures directly to my employee ID number. Then he read the SEC violation logs. "You forwarded unencrypted, Tier 1 client financials to a public Gmail server," David said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You bypassed the company firewall." "I was working from home," Marcus pleaded, stepping away from the podium and holding his hands up defensively. He looked toward the London clients, then back to David. The smug arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the pathetic, uncoordinated scrambling of a cornered rat. "It was just a rough draft. I did all the heavy lifting on this project, My name is embedded in the hexadecimal code of every single chart. Marcus, I said calmly. It has been there since October. He stopped talking. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The absolute totality of his defeat settled heavily over his shoulders. He looked at me, and for the first time in 3 years, he truly saw me. Not as a ghostwriter, not as a disposable safety net, but as the meticulous architect of his absolute ruin. David turned to the head of HR, who had been sitting quietly near the back door. Deactivate his badge immediately. Freeze all of his company accounts. Escort him out of the building. David, please, Marcus begged, tears of ultimate humiliation welling in his eyes. 20 years. I've given this firm 20 years. You're done, Marcus, David said, turning his back on him. 2 large security guards stood closely behind him as he shoved his expensive leather folios into a standard-issue cardboard box. He didn't dare look at me as he walked out the heavy glass doors for the final time. It was exactly how I had planned it. But what I found inside his locked desk drawer 30 minutes later changed everything I thought I knew about the past 3 years. Walking out of that room felt like victory. But the next 72 hours taught me what victory actually costs. The confrontation was the spark. What came after was the fire. They didn't collapse quietly. They collapsed loudly, messily, and in a way that exposed exactly who they had always been. Within an hour of Marcus being escorted out of the building, the head of human resources asked me to assist in inventorying his physical office space. They needed to secure any active client files before the IT department completely wiped his local hardware. His office was a monument to his ego, filled with expensive modern art and framed photographs of him shaking hands with industry titans. I began systematically emptying his desk. It was in the bottom right drawer, hidden beneath a stack of blank company letterheads, that I found the heavy, brass-locked firebox. Marcus, in his endless arrogance, had left the small silver key taped to the underside of his keyboard. I unlocked the heavy lid and pulled out 3 thick, manila folders. They all had my name printed on the tabs in his immaculate handwriting. I opened the first folder, and my blood ran cold. Inside were the original, unedited performance reviews submitted by the London partners over the past 3 years. They were glowing. They specifically cited my analytical brilliance and strongly recommended me for immediate promotion to senior partner track, along with a substantial performance bonus. Attached to these originals were the forged documents Marcus had actually submitted to HR. He had meticulously rewritten my reviews, removing every compliment and replacing them with carefully worded critiques. Competent, but lacks leadership presence, and requires constant senior supervision. But the second folder was the true devastation. It contained internal ledger printouts. By downgrading my performance, he had legally justified withholding my allocated annual bonuses nearly $50,000 a year. He hadn't just kept the money for the firm. He had systematically diverted those exact funds into his own executive discretionary pool. For 3 years, I had been agonizing over my student loan payments, budgeting my subway fares, and doubting my own professional worth. I had believed I just wasn't good enough. Meanwhile, Marcus was literally financing his bespoke suits and his Upper East Side penthouse with my stolen compensation. It wasn't just intellectual plagiarism anymore. It was calculated, premeditated financial embezzlement. When a cornered narcissist is stripped of their narrative control, they become the most dangerous version of themselves. Marcus didn't just go home and accept his defeat. By Wednesday morning, the Industry Whisper network was fully activated. My LinkedIn profile was suddenly flooded with anonymous views. He was calling managing partners at rival tech firms, frantically spinning a narrative of victimhood. He claimed I was an unstable, disgruntled assistant who had hacked his terminal and fabricated the SEC violation out of sheer romantic jealousy. He was launching a full-scale smear campaign, banking on the old boys club to protect one of their own and blacklist me from the industry forever. If you are listening to this, and something feels painfully familiar, if you have ever survived a smear campaign, you need to understand the fundamental difference between guilt and shame. Guilt tells you that you made a mistake. Shame tells you that you are a mistake. Narcissistic systems, whether in a family structure or a corporate hierarchy, deliberately weaponize shame to keep you silent and compliant. When they finally lose their control over you, They instantly try to control how others see you. They project their own internal rot onto your reputation. If you have ever felt that sickening, heavy dread of being universally misunderstood by people you respect, here is your exit strategy. Do not defend yourself to committed misunderstanders. Your silence is your ultimate shield, and your documented evidence is your absolute sword. Let them scream their fabricated victimhood into the void. One concrete, real-world action you can take today is to step completely out of the debate. Stop explaining your side of the story to people who are determined to misunderstand you, and simply hand the unvarnished facts to the authorities. I didn't post a rebuttal on LinkedIn. I didn't call the rival firms to defend my honor. I took the brass firebox and its contents directly to the firm's chief legal counsel and the federal auditors who were already investigating his SEC breach. I spent 4 grueling hours in a windowless deposition room. I thought I was ready for that moment. I wasn't, not entirely. The firm's legal stenographer was using an outdated transcription software that kept freezing, forcing me to repeat the most humiliating details of my suppressed performance review 3 separate times while my back ached in the stiff, ergonomic chair. It was exhausting, tedious, and profoundly unglamorous. But I kept my voice steady. I walked them through every single forged document, every diverted bonus, and every lie. When the corporate lawyers saw the physical proof of the embezzlement, the atmosphere in the room shifted from crisis management to absolute, ruthless retaliation. In corporate law, a clawback provision is the most terrifying phrase an executive can ever hear. Because Marcus had violated his fiduciary duty and committed active fraud against a subordinate, the firm wasn't just firing him. They legally froze his entire severance package. They halted his 401k match. They revoked his vested stock options. In a matter of 48 hours, his $2 million net worth was locked behind an impenetrable wall of corporate litigation. He had taken my money, my credit, and my confidence. I had just taken his entire future. But what I didn't know was that Marcus had one final, desperate card to play. As I packed up my cubicle that Friday evening, preparing to officially move into his vacated corner office, my phone vibrated loudly against the wood. It was a restricted number. I answered it, expecting a final follow-up from the legal team. Instead, I heard his breathing heavy, erratic, and terrifyingly close. And the single, chilling sentence he whispered through the receiver changed the entire trajectory of my revenge. "Tell me how much David paid you to frame me, and I'll double it." It was a whisper, but it echoed loudly in the quiet of my living room. He wasn't angry. He wasn't broken. He was negotiating. Even now, stripped of his title, his reputation, and his heavily inflated bank accounts, Marcus could not fathom a reality where I, his quiet, obedient subordinate, had simply outsmarted him. His ego was so massive, so incredibly fragile, that he had to believe I was a pawn in some grand executive conspiracy. To him, women like me didn't build traps. We just fetched coffee and collated printouts. I didn't laugh. I didn't yell. I let the silence stretch across the cellular connection for 5 excruciating seconds. I listened to his ragged, panicked breathing as the reality of my absolute silence began to crush him. "Goodbye, Marcus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and disconnected the line. I didn't block his number immediately. I walked over to my kitchen island, opened my laptop, and poured myself a glass of cold water. When you uncover corporate embezzlement, the firm handles the internal firing. But the firm's lawyers are ultimately trying to protect the firm. They want to bury the scandal, quietly redistribute the stolen funds, and move on as if the rot had never existed. I didn't want it buried. Because the moment he made that phone call, I realized that taking his job wasn't enough. A man who believes he can literally buy his way out of a mathematical truth is a man who will simply find another victim at another firm. I navigated to the official website of the Internal Revenue Service. I opened Form 211, the application for award for original information. I meticulously filled out every single field. I attached the hex code translation key. I attached the forged performance reviews. And most importantly, I uploaded the internal ledger printouts from his locked brass firebox, definitively proving the systematic diversion of untaxed executive bonus funds. I clicked submit, watching the loading bar glide smoothly across the screen. The federal government does not offer quiet severance packages or non-disclosure agreements. The federal government offers federal indictments. The following Monday, I arrived at the office at 8 a.m. sharp. The 42nd floor felt entirely different. The oppressive, nervous energy that used to hum beneath the fluorescent lights was entirely gone. The caterers were setting up fresh coffee, and junior analysts were actually chatting by the water cooler without looking nervously over their shoulders. David called me into his office at 10. He didn't sit behind his massive oak desk. He sat in one of the leather guest chairs, signaling a definitive shift in the hierarchy. He handed me a crisp, heavy folder. Inside was a formal offer for the senior partner track, retroactive to the date of my original, unedited performance review. Attached to the contract was a certified check for the entirety of my stolen bonuses, plus interest. "We are changing the locks on the corner office," David said quietly, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. "We want you to take it, Elena. You earned it. You earned all of it." I looked at the check. I looked at the title. 3 years ago, I would have cried tears of gratitude. I would have thanked him profusely for giving me what was rightfully mine. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I picked up the firm's heavy Mont-Blanc pen, signed my name with slow, deliberate precision, and slid the folder back across the table. "I'll need the walls repainted," I said calmly, "and a new desk. I don't want any of his furniture in my workspace." David nodded once. "Consider it done." Before I left for the day, I walked into Marcus's old office. The moving boxes were gone. The expensive modern art had been taken off the walls, leaving pale, rectangular shadows on the expensive wallpaper. The heavy brass firebox was sitting in an evidence locker downstairs. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city. I watched the taxicabs crawling along the pavement, just like I had during all those lonely 2 a.m. shifts. But this time, I wasn't a ghost haunting the building. I wasn't a safety net for a mediocre man. I was the architect. There is a very specific, profound kind of peace that fills a room when you finally stop contorting yourself to fit into someone else's shadow. For 3 long years, I truly believed that my value in this industry was tied directly to my quiet obedience. I thought that if I just worked hard enough, stayed late enough, and made myself completely indispensable, the corporate system would eventually recognize my worth and reward me. But a toxic system doesn't reward martyrs, it just consumes them. People who demand your absolute loyalty while stealing your light are never going to suddenly offer you a seat at the table. They view your empathy and your professionalism not as virtues, but as vulnerabilities to be ruthlessly exploited. I know now that respect is not something you earn by swallowing your truth and keeping the peace. Respect is something you enforce by drawing a hard line, documenting the reality, and refusing to back down when the ground shakes. You don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to be precise and trust your own brilliance. So look around your own life right now. Who is currently taking credit for your light, and what are you going to do about it? So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.